Breaking news. Close to a total export embargo to Russia is being considered by the United States and its Ukrainian ally. An absolute ban on most exports to Russia is being considered by some of Ukraine's key allies, including the United States, which could significantly increase economic pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin over his war. According to those with knowledge of the situation, Group of 7 officials are discussing the idea in advance of a leaders' summit in Japan in May, with the hope of including European Union member states in the crackdown. According to the sources, the proposal is still up for discussion and may be revised. According to these people, the proposed strategy being discussed by diplomatic envoys would completely reverse the sanctions regime currently in place, making all exports illegal unless specifically exempted. Unless specifically prohibited, all exports are permitted under the current criteria. Medicines and agricultural products, including food, according to one of the people, are very likely to remain exempt if the move is approved by G7 leaders at the summit. However, there may be significant roadblocks to implementation. Adoption of the new criteria by all European Union members is necessary for them to take effect, which could spark a contentious debate due to pushback from businesses that continue to export to Russia and the possibility of retaliation from Moscow. If an export ban is nearly enforced, the remaining trade between these countries and Russia would dry up. The National Security Council of the United States did not want to comment on the possibility of this action. Restrictions on everything from electronics to luxury goods have nearly halved the value of European Union and Group of 7 exports to Russia. There are still $66 billion worth of imports from Europe, the United States, Canada, and Japan, as reported by the Geneva-based Trade Data Monitor. The G7 is worried that this will help Putin's war economy too much, especially as Russia finds ways to circumvent sanctions by importing goods from third countries. The G7 and EU have imposed multiple rounds of sanctions, some of which were phased in over time. Russia has retaliated against sanctions by restricting its own exports and intermittently cutting off energy exports to Europe. If commodities like copper were to be restricted, the European Union would be hit particularly hard. And a total ban on exports to Russia could make Moscow look to China for alternatives to sanctioned goods, bringing the two countries even closer together. Moscow no longer releases import data, but many international organizations and governments still keep tabs on Russia's exports and customs data. According to Trade Data Monitor, Germany, Italy, and Poland are still the top 3 European countries exporting goods to Russia. Automobiles, chocolate, beer, footwear, flowers, and makeup are just some of the non-medicine and non-agricultural products that could be most impacted across the G7. Russia has still been able to import some components from the United States and Europe via third countries, despite the current restrictions. The G7 and the European Union are putting more effort into preventing the evasion of sanctions by increasing the scrutiny placed on so-called dual-use goods, which can be used for either military or civilian purposes. This effort has included diplomatic pressure on other nations, an expansion of sanctions to cover all goods linked to Russian weapons in Ukraine, and the targeting of businesses that may be unwittingly or intentionally assisting Moscow in circumventing sanctions. The United States imposed sanctions on dozens of entities in 20 countries earlier this month, accusing them of assisting Moscow in circumventing sanctions. Russian exports to Europe include palladium, copper, iron, and nickel, all of which are in high demand in the continent. The G7 summit is expected to focus heavily on increasing efforts to restrict Putin's economic influence. In addition, Bloomberg reported previously that leaders were making progress on a mechanism to track and trace Russian diamonds across borders, which could eventually pave the way for restrictions on the trade.